thought what I'd try and do for the keynote is really just set the scene of where I think planetary health and food research kind of intersect, or what makes it particularly planetary health. And as Melvin knows, some of the discussions we've had recently around the ethics of planetary health and food as distributive justice and distribution of food have been quite interesting. One of the things that I think gets lost sometimes in planetary health is the urban dimension. I think we tend to look very much at kind of a place in nature, agricultural systems, green and blue space, but we kind of forget sometimes where food actually fits in with this, and particularly sometimes with food animals, where we live with livestock, or how they're part of those food systems. And some of the work that I've been doing throughout COVID-19, both on the projects that Agan mentioned in India, which are very much about poultry farming and dairy farming, but also looking at food availability in the UK, particularly during lockdown and people's access to it, I think have thrown up some quite interesting issues and challenges for planetary health, particularly around the urban diet. And I think I'd probably like to just hang some of this on Amartya Sen, who's a famous Nobel Prize-winning economist. And he looked at what he called food entitlement, which is when you're considering food and whether people have enough food. It's about what he called these 4 A's, which are the availability of food. So very simply, whether food is available or not. And he made a very clear distinction between famine and starvation. So famine would be where the crops have failed and there literally is no food. But quite often when that happens, you find that the elite still have food, whether they're importing it, whether they're buying it, whether they're hoarding the small amount there is. And so the rest of the population are dying of starvation, not actually of the famine. And it's about that the inequity of the distribution. He also looked at access. So it may be about whether you can access the place where the food comes from. So that may be how easily can you go to the market, how far away is the market, and therefore how much can you carry back? Do you have a car so you can go once a week? If you go there, can you afford it? So there may be lots of food available, but you may not be able to buy what there is. And that's been something that's been very interesting in the UK, because a lot of food kitchens opened during COVID to give away food to people who are struggling to afford it, particularly if their jobs had closed down because of COVID. And what that highlighted is there was no shortage of food in the system, but the way the system is organized makes it very difficult for some people to be able to afford it. And so actually that raised some ethical questions around the dignity of food. And should you have to be reliant on charity if there's no shortage of food in the system? And the second one is adequacy, is which there may be food available, but it may not be food that is adequately nutritious. So there might certainly be a lot of junk food is cheaper, and therefore that's what people buy, rather than actually properly nutritious food being easily available, accessible and affordable. And I think these are all things that really are at the heart of what planetary health is about. And it also covers the time that is needed to shop, prepare and cook. So when we're looking at questions around food, certainly kind of food production and food preparation, and perhaps processed food, ready meals, to what extent does that have to be balanced against people's time and ability to shop, prepare and cook the food? There are also issues around whether people have the facilities to store and to cook food, and that's both at the market or at home. So whether markets, for instance, have freezers or cooler cabinets, and then whether, even if they do at the store, whether people have it at home. So one of the issues that's come into the work I've been doing in India is around pasteurization of milk. There's a government drive to pasteurize milk, but if people don't actually have a fridge at home to keep it in, it's much better for them to be able to go to the market, buy unpasteurized milk very locally, come back and boil it just before they drink it, which is what the local practice is. And that tends to be forgotten if you're looking at it outside from a very kind of large scale international industrial dairy process. And also one thing that we're finding, particularly around some of the groups we're working with, in the UK, is the need to be able to buy in bulk if you're going to be able to buy cheaply. And if people live in overcrowded homes, they may not actually have the storage space for that. So there are a lot of issues around nutrition that play into planetary health that I think are beyond actually just the food growing itself, which is where we tend to focus. And this also includes experience in education of being able to cook, knowing what nutritious food is and having access to the recipes. So some of you may be aware a few years ago, there was a commission on food, which was the Eat Lancet Commission, which came up with what it called the Planetary Health Diet. And this was actually looking at what was a healthy diet, not only from a human perspective, but in terms of the planet and the environmental impact of the food. And it's garnered quite a lot of attention, and particularly in the need in developed Western countries to shift away from a very heavily red meat-based diet to a plant-based diet, which has a much smaller carbon footprint. It actually isn't a vegetarian diet, which is quite often misrepresented as being, and it's certainly not a vegan diet, which again, it's often misrepresented as being. It does have small amounts of animal protein in the diet, particularly in terms of dairy and eggs, but also some meat. And I think this is very important for looking at that environmental impact of food, because once you go towards the vegan diet in particular, the protein in that becomes very processed, and it's not necessarily environmentally healthy, and it's also not necessarily nutritionally appropriate either. Whereas if you go to the I would say high animal welfare livestock systems, where you have smaller scale farms that aren't intensive, where the animals aren't enclosed, where they tend to graze on natural grazing ground, and also they have a much more natural lifestyle that provides small amounts of food. This is actually healthier, not only for the people themselves, but for the animals and for the environment, because you tend to keep the ecosystem services. So I think looking at how this planetary health diet plays out across different cultures and how it fits with existing cultural diets is very interesting. And that's very much what we've been doing in India in the projects I'll talk about in more detail later. So it's very important, I think, that we get this balance of food right within the Sustainable Development Goals. And within doing that, we don't shift developed countries away from actually more appropriate environmental and planetary health diets into a more processed Western diet, which we know brings with it all the issues of obesity and non-communicable diseases. We do need to be aware of the terrestrial land, the fresh water, and the greenhouse gas emissions of our food chains. And very important to think that although nearly 1 billion people go hungry every day, there are also 2 billion adults who are overweight or obese. So making sure that we get right what is the right balance of food. We certainly can have far too much food and far too much of the wrong food. So I think whenever we're thinking about food in terms of planetary health, we need to keep in very much within that planetary health framework of meeting the sustainability goals within the planetary boundaries. And I think that's food is one of the places where that is perhaps writ the largest. It's very easy, and we certainly do want to make sure that we definitely hit the targets on zero poverty. But the way that we do that in terms of food miles, of distributive justice, of making sure we do that without overusing pesticides, without removing too much of forestation, is extremely important. And I think that's something that needs to be at the heart of any discussions of planetary health and food. Biodiversity and human health is important. Again, the more natural diets there are and the more local diets are, the more biodiversity there tends to be. So again, it's not only about the quantity of food, it's also about the dietary diversity and making sure we hit dietary diversity scores. And if we do that, we're much more likely to grow and produce and eat our food in a way that is sustainable for the environment. I think this ties very much into global health systems. It's been very interesting that medical systems have been starting to be more and more interested in nutrition. And it was actually announced this morning that the In Vivo Planetary Health Network, which is probably the other main planetary health academic network that sits alongside the Planetary Health Alliance and works very closely with them, has just entered into a formal partnership with the Nova Institute of Health in the US. And the Nova Institute of Health actually supports quite actively some community gardening programs that not only look at how we grow food, but also looks at how you teach people to cook and do their own meals healthily. And it's quite unusual for a health system to actually go that far into what are traditional nutritional programs. And those in some cases are then funded through the mayor's office in Baltimore in the US under youth empowerment programs. So we're starting to see it's much more systematic approach to how food and health fit together in a very planetary health network. The idea 20 years ago of essentially a health institute being involved with the funding of community gardening would just not have been on the agenda. And I think actually it's very interesting to see those type of programs taking off. So I think this comes into one of the other things that I've been quite interested in recently, which is these advanced skills around communication, presentation, and writing. So if we're starting to see these issues around nutrition becoming more and more important, both for public health in general, but also as almost kind of leverages for public health policy and for climate change policy and for planetary health policy, how do we look to start communicating those into the policy world and presenting those both in case studies and in policy briefs that will kind of help to embed this more further into policy thinking as we go forward. That's where I think we are. I seem to have lost my last slide, but it was only my contact details. There we are. So that's really to kick it off. And I think those are the things that I would bear in mind when we're thinking about food. We need to think not only about nutrition and perhaps the micronutrients in the food or the protein energy balance, but actually look at that whole system. How is it grown? Where is it grown? How is it then transported? What kind of markets do we sell it in? And also what provision do we have at home, both for storing and cooking that food, in terms of the equipment we have, our stoves and fridges, but also our own knowledge of recipes and food. So hopefully that sets us up for some interesting discussions for the rest of the day. I'll be going into more detail of the actual projects I've been working on later on, but I hand the floor back to you for questions and the next speakers. Thank you.
So this is my topic for today: environmental systems dynamics and drivers to food security in Eastern Africa. I'm Dr. Judith Khazenzi. I started by defining some of the concepts in the title. Environmental systems being the interaction between the different spheres of the earth. In this case, we are looking at the lithosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. All of these are interlinked, and usually when one is affected, there is going to be an effect on the other sphere. The lithosphere mainly is the surface crust or the underlying rock and the geological formations. The biosphere is that living part of the environment, which will be mainly the plants, animals, and all that is above the surface. The hydrosphere will be mainly the water sphere. That would be the water bodies, rivers, oceans, even humidity in the atmosphere. And then we have the atmosphere, which is that gaseous sphere that envelopes the Earth or the planet. All these are interlinked together. Now, when we think about system dynamics, we are looking at how theory, methods, and the philosophy are all combined together to explain system behavior. And the different systems or the different spheres of the environment all work together and have a form of systems dynamics. Then we have what are drivers. These are now just any natural or human-induced factor that directly or indirectly causes a change in an ecosystem. And in our context, I took the drivers to be those that affect change in food security, especially in terms of environmental drivers. And then what is food security? The first speaker elaborated well what food security is. It entails food availability. So the food must be available. That would be probably made available through production. Then we have food access. That is when you are able to get that food. And food stability or resilience. In this case, if we have any calamity or any crisis that comes into effect, you should still be able to get food. So that makes the food stability. We also have food utilization, where we have the food once consumed should be able to provide the proper nutrients for whoever is consuming the food to be able to benefit from. So the four aspects of this provide food, gives rise to food security. So for food security, we must have all those four dimensions. So I've tried to explain availability of food, that we must have it in good sufficient quantities, and I've highlighted appropriate quality, because we know quality of food is very crucial, that we need to have food that is of proper quality to be consumed. We may have toxic chemicals in the food, then that will reduce the quality of the food. So access, I have already explained, one should be able to get the food and also have the means to purchase the food, so you can access it. For stability, you need to have security in the food. It should always be adequate at all times, irrespective of any crisis coming up. Food utilization, we require the food in proper nutritional content for the consumers. So having explained the different terms, therefore food security is a product of many variables. We know that we need to produce the food, we need to transport the food, store the food, avail the food. So the major variables of concern in food security are the physical factors such as climate, the soil type on which the food is grown, water availability for the food to grow properly. We also have the drivers for food security or insecurity, which would be food prices. If the food prices are high, then that will make access to the food low for those who are not economically empowered. If we have rising demand for the food because of probably population growth, then that would mean that the accessibility of the food may reduce because of the number of people who require this food, or the amount of food may also reduce, again, depending on the people who require the food. So if we have higher demand and less production, then we will have food insecurity. And on the other hand, if we have enough production, then we can be able to have food security. Then we may have also changing consumption patterns affecting food security or insecurity. In instances where people would prefer a certain type of food over another, that would mean that there will be higher demand for that specific food, unlike the other. So when we have changing consumption, that can also drive food security. If we have pressure on production rates, where in this case you may probably have a large amount of food required, you do not have enough land to plow on, and so you may need to put more pressure by trying to produce more food. That in itself, maybe trying to use some intensive form of farming may also either increase the food security or reduce the food security, depending on the context. So this chart is giving just the direct drivers of change in this particular case in terms of food production. If we have climate change, flooding, droughts, disease incidents, that can, on one hand, reduce the food production, and in that case, reduce the amount of food that will be available, and hence contribute to food insecurity. We may also want to have change of land use. When we have change of land use, so that we have land that could be used for agriculture being changed to mining, for example, that would reduce the amount of food that would have come out from that land cover, so that it reduces food availability. So we also have external inputs that we may want to use to improve food production. In this case, we have fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation. These on their own, again, have an effect on the environment, but they are used in production increase for food so that we are able to provide more food, and in that case, have food security. Watering points may also have a certain impact on food production. If, for example, we have irrigation that we are using to produce food, we require to have enough water. So the chart generally gives us the direct drivers for change, whether food production or food security or environmental change. This shows just effect of drought on food security, where now the family below does not have food because of the drought, and that means then they are insecure in terms of food. The indirect drivers to food security, demographic, I have already talked about population increase. The higher the population, then there's the more demand on food. And if there is not enough food production, then the food security, there would be no food security. Economic drivers in terms of accessing the food. One needs to buy the food. If not economically empowered, then they do not have access to the food and therefore suffer food insecurity. We may also have socio-political drivers. For example, conflicts where we have war, it then has an effect on food security because people cannot access the food. We may also have change in government, HIV/AIDS being a disease that may require special nutrition. Those are some of the social political factors that may drive food security. We also have cultural and religious factors, scientific and technological factors that may affect food security. Now, each of these drivers would affect differently food security depending on whether if specific countries or regions are affected. If we can compare the developing world and the developed world, they would be affected differently by the different key drivers. For the developing worlds, which East Africa is one of them, there is low capacity economically, so we may get more food insecure because of low economy. So many people are not able to access the food. There are also factors about climate that would be different in the different regions that may also affect the food security. In Africa, we have conflict. There's been a lot of conflict, especially in Somalia and Sudan, which may affect the food security. Sometimes we get extreme climate change, where we have areas of drought and several parts of East Africa. In Kenya, for example, northern part of Kenya would suffer from drought, and that would affect food security. Now, during food production, we have effects that will affect the environment, as well as environment in itself affecting food production. So when we are looking at food security in terms of food production, we know that we are going to get some change in the environment from the food production activities, and changes in environment can also affect food production. So the two have some linkage. Now, in this case where we have environmental changes that affect food security, mainly arising because of affecting food production would be climate change. We have land degradation, we have water scarcity and water quality, where climate change would lead to natural disasters, such as flooding and storms, where if we have flooding over a farm or an area where food crop is growing, it's going to affect that particular growth of the food. So we end up with a lower yield. Sometimes climate change will result in long period of drought, which we've already said it would affect again the production of the food. We get new pests and new diseases that come up, which affect the food. Like in Kenya, for example, storage of maize has been affected by pests that have come up, and it is not possible to store the maize for very long periods because of these pests that are difficult to eradicate, all arising because of change in the climate. And that means that the pests now have a better environment to grow in or to perpetuate in. Climate change also leads to higher temperatures, which in time will actually lead to drought. Climate change also may, or food production may result in increased carbon dioxide concentration, which is a greenhouse gas. And in itself will have, again, climate change effects or increase of temperature over a period of time. So depending on what change of climate occurs, you may have lower production or higher production, where higher production would come in terms of increased rainfall due to the different climatic change. In areas where we had less rainfall, that may increase production of food. Now, it's been estimated that coming to 2080, in years to come, we may have climate change effects resulting in lower production of food to such percentages as 15 to 30% less production, which in itself then would mean that we will have less food, and that will affect food security in the negative. In terms of land degradation, due to food production, we may have nutrients being reduced in the soil, or we may also have, depending on what activity is taking place in that region, if we have toxic substances that have contaminated the soils, there is the possibility that we get the toxic substances into the food or uptake of toxic substances from food. If the land has been degraded in such a manner that we have contamination due to toxic substances. Overgrowing of plants or growing of plants over and over, or crops over and over again on the same land may reduce the nutrients in that particular soil, and that means that production of food may reduce as years go by. Water scarcity in itself can lead to less production if we do not have enough water for the crops to grow. On the other hand, if irrigation is being used for growth of the crops, it may be affected by the water quality. In this particular case, the quality of the food, if the water quality for irrigation is not proper, it is possible that the food that grows from this may be contaminated by the toxic substances or those contaminants that have affected the water that is being used in the irrigation. Food production then contributes to environmental change by soil degradation, where I have already talked about reduction of the nutrients from the soil. We can also have heavy metals, contamination of the soil, where the heavy metals may come from the fertilizers or the pesticides that are used during the food production. Water quality may also be affected, especially because, again, of the use of the fertilizers and pesticides, where we get runoff into water bodies and we get nutrients increase in amount in the water bodies. We may also have some pesticide residues in the water. Air pollution is contributed to during food production, especially where we are using machinery for the production. In this case, the machinery will be contributing to the greenhouse gases. In this particular case, carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide and the oxides of nitrogen. Some of the pesticides may also get into the atmosphere, contributing to the air pollution. Now, again, in food production, we may have land cover being reduced to provide land for the food crops. This also contributes to loss of biodiversity in the area that has been cleared. It can also contribute to global warming because of less cover, or the carbon dioxide sink has been reduced. It can also lead to drought, which in itself, again, affect food production. So in attaining food security, we have environmental effects that may affect the food production, and food production in itself may also, again, lead to environmental changes. This is a photograph just showing loss of land cover where trees have been felled, which can be used to provide more land for food crops. Here we have machinery, which contributes to air pollution. And next to this farm, there is a water body. So water runoff can also contribute to the water pollution in this particular case. Food quality may also be affected by the use of pesticide. In this case, I'm thinking about food such as tomatoes. We may get pesticide residue on the food, and that then means it is not of good quality for consumption. We also have poor storage that can lead to contamination of food. For example, aflatoxin in maize. Not so long ago in Kenya, we have had some maize flour being removed from shelves because of the some of the maize flour had been found to have higher amounts of aflatoxin. So that in itself then reduces food security or leads to food insecurity. I've given examples of Eastern African countries, Kenya, where we, as one country, where we have had cases of food quality coming in, for example, that of aflatoxin, where food has been removed from shelves. Generally, because of lower production capacity, we may not be able to produce food that is sufficient. And in Kenya, for example, we still import food from neighboring, maize from neighboring countries to be able to provide sufficient food for the population. Sometimes we have degraded resources affecting, again, food production in the East African region. Having given the example of maize flour being removed from shelves, it then means that some measures are being undertaken to try and improve food security. Removing the maize from the shelves is a way of trying to make sure that food is of quality that is proper for consumption. So measures are being put in place to try and reduce or to try and improve food security by either trying to improve production of the food or ensuring that the food quality is proper, or even trying to have policies that will mitigate or help in climate change mitigation so that we are able to produce proper food. There have been cases of agricultural insurance being given to farmers to be able to upscale climate resilience, grow foods that can withstand climate change, so that we are able to improve the food quality in the region. So we have an example here of foods that can withstand changes in the climate, and therefore, if adopted, are going to help improve the food security. We have a photograph here where we have growth of plants and trees together so that we can improve effects of climate change in the region. So you have more trees interplanted with the crops. So in conclusion, we can say that food security can be affected by a range of environmental changes, both at global or local levels, but at the same time, they also result in environmental change. And therefore, priority should be given to sustainable production of food so that there is proper environmental conservation measures that are taken, as well as having enough food for the population. We could also adopt climate change policies that will try to see how food production can be enhanced in the face of climate change. Foods that are resilient could be encouraged for growth, and taking measures that may try to reduce effects of climate change. Thank you.
I'll briefly be talking about malnutrition and health inequalities, and bringing ideas of a Bayesian modeling approach. And then I just put some ideas from one of our recent work, and I acknowledge the people that I have done some of the work that have been published in this paper that I have put on the screen. Okay, great. So just to give a context of what I want to talk about this afternoon, I must appreciate already that the two presentations we've had so far tie in very well with what I want to discuss this afternoon, looking at food production and also the ecosystems and all that which we have looked at already. My talk is quite specific to child malnutrition, and the idea is to zero in on the effect of prolonged malnutrition, which we call stunting, and then also try and look at this idea with respect to inequalities, and then how this is affected by the changing climate, but also really zeroing on the idea of then the inequalities that are there. From a global context, for sure, we see that there's a huge burden of undernutrition, which remains a challenge. And for sure, low and middle income countries really face the greatest severity. And we see that most of the risk factors associated with ill health and diarrhea are faced within these regions, and could lead to severe illness and death. And so we see Africa, as we now talk about the Eastern African region, but Africa in general, or Sub-Saharan region, is really struggling with this issue of malnutrition, chronic malnutrition. And also we see that now the problem is compounded with the effect of climate change. And why I appreciate the previous presentations, because then we see how climate change is associated to food production. And then as we look at then food production, how it relates to child nutrition. And if you look at it from a global perspective as well, you'd want to talk about the SDGs and how then low and middle income countries will lag behind achieving the goals of the SDGs because of the differences that we see in between countries and within countries with respect to child malnutrition. All right, so I give an work for Zambia, and we looked at the idea was to analyze chronic growth failures or malnutrition within Zambia, just to demonstrate how then we can use these modeling approaches and use rich ideas of analysis of spatial data, environmental data, and then we combine this with socioeconomic factors that can predict nutrition or malnutrition in children. So for the Zambian context, just to give you a picture, we find that we kind of slightly see an improvement in the general nutrition, but then we see a lot of regional inequalities with respect to nutrition. And with respect to the same issues of malnutrition, we see that then we have these disparities within poor and rich countries at world level, but also within countries, we see these inequalities with respect to wealth, with respect to health as well. So my this afternoon is to more discuss the make an argument that we need more availability of disaggregated data so as to strengthen the monitoring and accountability of different indicators within countries. Also, if we have georeference data, we can really make better predictions in terms of the effect of the climate change. Just bringing this into perspective, how then nutrition and climate change are interlinked. This is something that we have already been discussing with the previous presenters. But then you see how then the composition of the atmosphere with respect to the oxides would then affect our climate, as it were. And this science has been discussed broadly at different spheres. But also, maybe I must mention that then this comes to affect the agro ecosystems, where we have now differences in the prevalence and the duration when we have pests and other diseases that will affect livestock, forests, cultivated plants, and aquatic life. So in general, then with these agroecosystems changing, this changes the agricultural production and post-harvest consequences. And these will lead to changes in the prices, the quantity and quality of the agro products. And also then the market changes, and then it goes down to affecting the access, availability, utilization of agricultural products, and even the stability, which is what we have been discussing previously. So the idea then was to use, or the idea is to use then different modeling approaches, such as Bayesian distribution and regression, so that we can analyze some of these complex spatial temporal trends. We appreciate linear and nonlinear relationships, and also control for complex covariant interactions, because then, as you see then, the quite complex factors that come into play with respect to then having an outcome of nutrition or malnutrition in these children. So we may look at pollution levels, we may look at the drought consequences, urbanization, and wealth, as well as probably the education of mothers in different regions. So if we are to take into account all these covariates or all these factors that could contribute to child nutrition, then we need these kind of methodologies which are quite flexible to model all this. So one of them, among several, is the Bayesian distributional regression. And in this work, then we took into account several factors from different sources, such as demographic health survey, things like asset index, mother's health for these children that we're analyzing, birth order, breastfeeding duration, education of the mother, household size, mother's BMI, number of vaccinations, drought severity, malaria incidence, population density. So these are like some of the selected predictors that we used to model stunting. And then what we see generally is that we, using two waves of demographic health survey, we're able to see differences in terms of the patterns of nutrition. Like I said in my preamble, one thing that we're interested in is to look at the inequalities, to see the differences within regions, but also identify the different factors or covariates that could predict this nutrition within countries in the African region. So then, just to share some of then the results, for example, the education of the mother significantly predicts a child's nutritional status. And traditionally, we have been modeling factors like covariates like education in a linear fashion, but now I show how we can get much more richer information if we are to use Bayesian models as well. So generally we see then, if you look at the map on my left, top left, so we see where there's blue or blau, we see then that these areas that where children have better nutrition, and then as you go up north, you see where it's red, the nutrition is bad. And then you compare this for 2011 demographic health survey, and then the 2014 one as well. But more than that, we're able to see also the effect on the standard deviation. So this is where we see the inequalities. So then regions like this one on the northwestern side, it indicates an area where there is high inequality within the region. So it means then that we have children that are really worse off with respect to nutrition and worse off within the same region. So it's an area of high inequality. Okay, and this persists also in the next wave of the demographic health survey. And we are able also to, for example, model in a nonlinear fashion the effect of mother's education. And interestingly, what we see is that with respect to the nutrition of children, for the Zambian scenario, which I present now, so grade schools run from grade 1 up to the 12th grade, and then thereafter, then is the tertiary level of college, university, and all. So what we see here is that then with respect to the nutrition of children, we don't see much difference in terms of the influence of the mother's education until this about the 8th grade, okay? After the 8th grade, 8 years in school, and then we see a huge contribution with respect to the nutrition of children. So children who are born from mothers that have gone above the 8th grade then drastically tend to have better nutrition. So we see this as the effect on the mean for the standard deviation, the Z scores, the Z scores. On this side, then we also look at on the right side, rather to say it correctly, on the right side, then we see the effect on the standard deviation. And equally, we see that there's a sharp decline in terms of the deviation, the differences in outcome after the 8th grade. So then there's not so much difference in terms of the huge differences in the health status of the children when the mother has gone beyond the 8th grade. So this is very important, particularly because then the argument has always been the mother's education improves the child's nutrition status. But that what we demonstrate here is that actually then these mothers have to be educated beyond the primary school level until they get to the high school level, the 8th grade. That's when you begin to see the meaningful difference in terms of the contribution of the mother's education. All right, so we also modeled malaria incidence. We have a bit wide credible interval, but then the picture is that the nutrition status goes down as we have a higher incidence of malaria within different regions. And how this ties in to climate change is that then we see new patterns of malaria incidences within regions in Africa because of the changing climate. Temperatures are changing, precipitation is also changing in different regions. And so some of these vector-borne diseases tend to have new patterns. All right. So to maybe sum it up, what we see here is a strong nonlinear relationship for education of the mother and also the wealth of the household on the height of the children, on the stunting levels of the children. And also what we observe then is that there is contribution of remote sense covariates, but alone they don't give us a full picture. Hence the need to combine both remote sense covariates and other predictors to see how then this predicts a child's nutrition. And also for the specific case of Zambia, we see that stunting, which is chronic malnutrition, is still unacceptably high. And also that we observe these regional differences that we demonstrated up north within the country. And though we observe some decline, which I acknowledged in the beginning, this is way below what is expected for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And using the methodology that we demonstrate here, the spatial methods really help us to observe these patterns. So one, they help us to model in a new fashion. For example, we can see nonlinear relationships that I've demonstrated, but much more also, we can specifically see regions that are affected by different things. And so as we look at, for example, climate change, that could be quite uniform across regions, but we see that the vulnerability of different areas within a country is really different. And this is true also from an African perspective, that then there'll be areas that are more vulnerable than the others. So using these methodologies, then we can prioritize these areas so that interventions are specific to these areas. And so we can see how then different regions are being affected by the changing climate. And so I also mentioned here that climate change is therefore a crisis on child nutrition. And it goes without saying that kids that start off with a poor nutrition then are more burdened for other health consequences as they grow up. And also, I think we have observed this in our medical practice and also we see in various studies that have been published in literature that these kids, their mental faculties as well is affected due to this chronic undernutrition that they may be exposed to. And so thank you so much for putting this talk together and for having you here. And I'm happy to end here, and we can converse more as we get to the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Looking at some of my personal research, as I mentioned, some of which has been with the University of Eldoret, but looking at particularly, I suppose, that role of animals within the food systems. And I think it's something that's really struck me as a global north researcher, where we don't live kind of as closely with animals as some of the global south environments do, that we can sometimes forget the role of animals in food systems, and certainly kind of forget how we need to consider animals in terms of the animal welfare and their role in it as well. So this is really a quick run through of some of the research that we've been doing, and where I think there's a real opportunity for kind of planetary health lenses on some of these issues. So planetary health, I don't need to explain to any of you what it is, which is quite good. But one of the things that I did when I was working at Oxford on the planetary health programme there is we mapped the planetary health literature to have a look at why were articles that were published in the Lancet Planetary Health, what made them planetary health rather than global health or just public health or medical articles. And one thing that there always was very strongly was this relationship between humans and the environment. So it always looked at the environment's impact on human health. And it tended to look at it through this very solutions-focused lens of whether it was political, economic, social, technological, legal, or ethical. It looked at kind of how you then made sure that you weren't just highlighting a problem, you proposed a solution as well. But what's quite noticeable about that to me, and has been noticeable about some of the conversations we've had recently, is that their animals are virtually invisible in that. There's actually not a lot of concern or focus on animals within planetary health. And that's either in terms of the health of the animals themselves, or the relationship between animal health and human health, where animals do come into planetary health, they're almost entirely considered as part of food systems, and that's normally in terms of removing them from the food system, so significantly cutting down the amount of animal protein that we eat, and it's kind of linked to greenhouse gases, or they're considered in terms of companion animals and pets and their relationship with that to well-being. But we don't really look at the farming systems where humans and animals look very closely together. And so that's really something that's been in my mind, and I think is worth highlighting within the field. So if you look at the case studies on the Planetary Health website, there are 12 case studies that can be used as educational tools when you're training planetary health or running university programs on planetary health. Only one of them really involves animals at all. And that's one from this case study in Senegal, which is looking at reintroducing prawns as natural predators, which eats the snails and therefore reduces some of the diseases that come with snails. It also provides a source of food and income. But it's only one amongst 12. And again, it really highlights that perhaps we're not taking as much notice of animals within planetary health as we should do. And CABI, who are an agricultural publishers who are also starting to branch more into global health, who you may be aware of, they have a OneHealth platform. They also produce a very good OneHealth textbook. And they're currently looking for good case studies of OneHealth case studies that are more interdisciplinary and perhaps tip a little bit more into the public health space. And so I think some planetary health research that is considering the role of animals could be a good source of case studies for CABI's platform. And this kind of brings me to the projects that I started working on in India about 4 or 5 years ago, which then led into the project I've been doing with Eldoret. We were looking at really the use of antibiotics within the Indian livestock sector. The use of antibiotics within livestock worldwide is known to be a problem. It's a real driver of antibiotic resistance. India is a particular hotbed of both unregulated antibiotic use and also the emergence of new resistant genes. Some of you may be aware of the New Delhi beta-lactamase 1, MDM1 gene, which is kind of the first resistance to fourth generation antibiotics, which is a massive public health problem worldwide. And so we were funded under the Newton-Baba scheme, which is a joint UK-Indian government scheme, to go and investigate really the use of antibiotics in India. And this on one level was a microbiology project. So it was taking environmental swabs and looking at where do you find resistant genes? Do we know kind of how they get into the food chain? How do they travel around? And then also on the social science side, perhaps again, a reasonably straightforward CAP survey of farmers and vets looking at why they prescribe antibiotics in a way that's not really ideal for keeping antibiotic resistance under control. But what came out very strongly when we were interviewing farmers back in 2019, this was just before kind of the global travel became more difficult, is that there was a huge pressure of climate change on the farmers. A lot of the farmers who were poultry farmers had gone into it reasonably recently. They had previously been crop farmers, but the crops were less likely to grow, or they were less secure. And so farmers were moving over to poultry farming, which was certainly less water intensive. It was less seasonally vulnerable. So it was kind of a more secure income. But it also had a lot of resource issues with it, particularly as discussed around whether you need electricity to, for instance, keep the sheds cool, whether you're removing some of the green land, and whether that takes away ecosystem services. And we know that animal and livestock food systems in general have higher carbon footprints. So we started to see this kind of cycle, I suppose, of climate change that was pushing farmers into a form of farming that is actually long-term worse for climate change, but offered kind of a quick fix of making sure that they had some food to eat. And just to give an example, the village here, you can see, which is a village called Herabala, just outside Bengaluru. This is a village where traditionally the two industries had been duck farming, and they'd had a communal village pond where they raised ducks and then sold those ducks at local markets. Over the last 10 years, the duck pond has completely dried up. So the duck farming industry is gone. And these grids here are where they grow silkworms. And it had been a big silk industry. But again, the silkworms were dependent on being fed by the mulberry bushes. And mulberry bushes, again, are becoming under greater stress from climate change and drought. And so there aren't the mulberry berries to feed the silkworms. And so the silk industry is going as well. And these are typical villages where they're now moving over to this kind of reasonably small scale poultry farming, but very intensive. The animals tend to get sick, both because of the intensive conditions, but also because of climate change, because of heat stress. And this pushes a lot of antibiotics into the system. So we're starting to see this real kind of feedback loop between climate change and farming practices and the use of antibiotics. And what we're starting to do now is actually trying to link this very closely to the climate data. So we can first of all prove that moving over just into poultry farming isn't necessarily the answer, because if you get high mortality in the years where it's hotter, or you get more hotter days, this is also unsustainable. So it might be a short-term fix when the crop's not growing, but it's not sustainable long-term. And what it may need to do is for the poultry industry as a whole to perhaps look at some of the areas where the climate hasn't been ideal for poultry farming over the last 50 years. Perhaps it's been kind of too wet or too cold at certain times of year. But as the climate changes, you may want to shift the industry around to different parts of the country, and then look at what you can actually do to replace crop farming in areas where the crops aren't sustainable anymore with more sustainable industries. And so we've been mapping this on quite a granular level. One of the things we also became very interested in is the distance that food travelled from market. So what we did in mapping the area where we're working, and this is up in Assam as well as down in Bengaluru, with interviews with market traders, we asked where they got their food from. And one of the things that's quite interesting there is that some food, so particularly dairy from dairy cattle and eggs, and tend to come from quite close to the market. And also pigs and goats tend to be literally walked to the market in the morning, slaughtered at the market and sold back to the local community. So the food system for particularly pigs and for goats and for dairy was very small. It was usually about a 4 to 5 kilometre radius. Then when you got to chickens and poultry and kind of small livestock, birds in particular, it tended to become bigger. It became more like about a 25 to 50 kilometre radius, where traders would go around villages further out, collect all of these birds in, and then bring them back to the market. And fish travelled much wider distances. They quite often travelled from the other end of India, so literally over hundreds of kilometres. And what this meant in terms of antimicrobial resistance is obviously the further the animals travelled, the further the bacteria that they carried and the resistance genes within that bacteria could travel as well. So there was a real argument from a kind of planetary health perspective of keeping food systems as small as possible, so that you don't give this opportunity of genetic material to mix over large areas. And we're trying to map that really now across India to see exactly the distance, so map some of the phylogenetic trees onto the geographical maps. But what we were also interested in very much was this role of the wet markets in the local nutrition, and whether having these markets where there was opportunity to sell local produce was also an incentive for the local communities to raise that produce themselves. And so that to keep a cow, you may not need to actually drink all of the milk yourself, but if there was a local market where you could sell half of it, it was an incentive to keep that cow. And whether that not only improved your own nutrition as a family, but provided milk for the local community as well, it meant that the community as a whole had better access to some of this high quality animal protein. And also what we noticed was that there was really there was a shift at the point that it's very similar to some of the things that Given said in his presentation about this threshold, where you see things moving from below the threshold to above the threshold, of families who kept animals really for their own use, but there was a bit of excess that they sold. And when this moved over into being a commercial enterprise, so when they started to keep animals in order to sell the produce, and that was the main part of family income. And what we started to see at that point is that that's when animals started to become enclosed. They started to take them off the common grazing grounds. They tended to keep them in sheds, and then they tended to import food from other parts of the country and feed them straw or hay or rice bran. So you started to see again this slightly more complex relationship between the livestock keeping and the environmental conditions, and certainly some of the ecosystem services that come with that grazing land. We were going to continue that in India, but then India moved off the ODI low-income country list, and we couldn't. And so we contacted Malvina Eldoret to see if we could shift it to Kenya. And she and the rest of Eldoret were fantastically helpful in enabling us to do that. And so we took the idea that actually having these wet markets and local backyard farming improves the nutrition at different scales, right from the family to the community to the region, and took that methodology and carried out the research project in Kenya, in Eldoret, and we're now in the process of looking through and analysing the data from that. But this it throws up some really interesting issues. You can see here that this is really what we're looking at. This is a family who now have a couple of chickens they keep in their backyard. They'll be using the eggs for their own use. They may be selling a few locally. When the chickens die naturally or around feast times, they also have that chicken protein. But this isn't an industrialized system, but the protein that's coming from that is actually very healthy. It's certainly much healthier than, for instance, chicken McNuggets or fast food chicken that you tend to see in the more industrial systems, certainly the more urban systems. And there's no particular reason why this couldn't be in the center of a city. This kind of system works, whether it's a rural village, whether it's peri-urban environments, or whether it's in the middle of not the most built up areas, but certainly kind of suburban areas of quite developed cities. And also tied to that, we were looking at things like the butcher shops, whether they have cooler cabinets as well, whether they have frozen meat, and whether this is, if it is available at the market, whether that is available then back in people's homes. One thing that's come out of that as well is what might possible alternatives be. We know in the area around Eldoret, there seems to be a particular problem with iron deficiency. and are there quick wins that we can introduce to that as the projects go on. We look particularly at this. These are small fishes that are dried, but you can also grind these into fish meal and add them to other foods to improve nutrition, and certainly some of the micronutrients in food. So can we potentially look at perhaps adding fish meal into this, perhaps look at supporting more chickens and backyard livestock rearing in these areas, rather than seeing it as something that we need to move away from as we go through a development process. And we've also started to think about potentially what's called keyhole gardens, which are small gardens where you can grow certain small vegetables and herbs. And you can see here again, a lot of these houses tend to have their own vegetable patch as well. So bringing this food back to very, very local and very hyper local food systems. And this is something that we're hoping to look at both in Eldoret, but also in the UK and also in the US, where urban gardening is growing in popularity. So I think there's a real opportunity to look at how these food systems are arranged around the world, and to move away from this. And I think that there does tend to be in the global north this idea that our food systems are the way everything should be, and we should move everybody else away from traditional food systems and from local markets. And it's very interesting when we look at markets like this one. If they're in a developing country, we call them wet markets. If they're in a developed country, we call them farmers markets. And yet actually the way they're set up and the things that are sold on them are exactly the same. And I think getting past some of that really divisive language, that wet markets are kind of something that, they're dirty, they're unhygienic, they're not good, and we need to get rid of them so we can have a more industrial food system, as opposed to farmers markets, which are, this kind of new, modern, progressive, more organic way of living. If you actually look at what happens in them, it's virtually the same. And I think that's been really interesting for me to try and get across to some of my colleagues who, don't work in developing countries, that when they're talking about wet markets, what they're actually talking about is the farmers market we have around the corner, and there's really not a lot of difference between them. So that goes back really to the things I talked about in the first presentation around, how we think about food security and basic human needs. I'm not going to go through this slide particularly again because I put it into the first presentation, but I think looking really at how we understand those food systems internationally and what we can learn from each other about the way that we produce and sell food and how we use it in our homes and in our communities at both a community scale as well as individual person or individual family level, I think is important. And I think that's something that there isn't a huge amount of research on, is really that the community food system, which is, not national, it's smaller than that, it's bigger than the family, but how food moves around within a community and how it's shared. And that comes back again, I think, to some of the ways about kind of food distribution and justice. These are just a couple of people I put down who I think are doing really quite innovative work in food systems, who they tend to come more from the social science side. So particularly scientists tend to be slightly less aware of them. Steve Hinchliffe and Claire Chandler in particular do a lot of work with antibiotics and antimicrobial resistance in food systems. Marco Springman, you probably do know, he was one of the authors on the Eat Lancet Commission. Alice Holkover and Leah Gibbs look at really what they call animal geographies, but is putting animals at the centre and trying to think about how these systems look to an animal, what their experiences are within them. And there's also Jason Rohr in the USA, who works at the Laboratory of Ecology and Public Health at Notre Dame University. So these are people whose research I would suggest it's worth looking at if you haven't come across them before, because I think they're really doing some quite innovative things with the way that we think about food and food systems, and particularly the role of animals in those food systems. That I think there's a gap in the research for future research and projects. I think it's that at the end is just I just put a few of the papers that I've worked on, particularly on food. 3 of them, they're really the 3 of them are mainly from the India project, looking at the food and the wet markets in India. And then there was this was really the one on wet markets that led to the project with Eldoret. But I know that some of the discussions we have had so far with Melvin and the other researchers in Eldoret, there certainly seems to be an appetite to do something around solutions for the next stage of the project, and to actually look at perhaps whether we can look at how could we change the local food system to make it more conducive to particularly getting around the problems there seem to be with the iron deficiencies. So I think as we go forward, that's certainly something that I would really like to discuss more with you, and particularly looking at what the solutions to some of those might be at that, very small, very community level, working with the knowledge that's already in those communities to look at what's best and perhaps co-designing some solutions at the local level. So thank you very much once again for having me. I'm sure these conversations will continue, and look forward certainly to over the next few months as we further analyse the results from the Kenya project. Thank you.